Hello and welcome to the Smart Home Maker podcast. It is great to have you here. Today I have a guest with me again. Today Lukas is joining me once more here on the podcast. Welcome, Lukas. Glad to have you here.
Glad to meet you.
And for today's podcast, we thought we'd take a little time to talk a bit about some of our favorite automations that we use in our smart homes. We'll be sharing our personal experiences with these automations, discussing why we like them, and talking about how they help us in our daily routines. So I think there's something here for everyone, because you might also learn a bit about what kind of automation ideas are out there. But of course, we also look forward to your feedback because maybe you have some cool automation ideas that we don't even know about yet. So feel free to drop them in the comments afterwards. All right, then let's get started right away. Let's go.
Smart home maker, rock the beat. Innovation at your feet. Build it up, don't complicate. Home solutions, you're the mate.
We wanted to talk a bit about automation, and we had a brief chat beforehand and said maybe we should start with the basics before we dive into the more advanced and crazier automations. Why don't you go ahead and start telling us a bit, what are the basics that are most important to you in your smart home, where you would say, these are the automations you wouldn't want to live without?
Maybe just a follow-up question right at this point. Do you actually have anything really out there, something crazy, like something that isn't so
standardized? We'll hear a bit more about that later.
Okay, I'm curious.
Nothing too out there, but I do have a few automations that you don't really need, but they're sometimes funny or cool to use, and I think we can definitely talk about those a bit more. But I don't have anything really wild.
Okay, maybe that'll come later. I mean, we don't know what kind of feedback we'll get. Maybe by next time we'll have no idea what's truly crazy, what the world hasn't seen yet. Yeah, so top automation. When we talk about top automation, for me, it's always like, what does top even mean? And for me, it's definitely the things that make my everyday life easier on the one hand, and on the other hand, also those out there crazy things. I mean, we experiment with smart homes. Sometimes we might even take it a bit to the extreme and push the limits. But honestly, what's really top for me at home is what happens at the foundation, I have to say. So yeah, it might sound boring, kind of cliche, but shutters, lights, the things where if I say this now, I'll probably at some point get lynched, but where you really just don't want to have to think about it. So I don't find it creepy at all, but for me, it's already become so far removed from reality to actually press a light switch. When I come into the office in the morning, you wouldn't believe how often I don't even press the light switch. Or since we're already talking about automation, I had a presence detector from Homematic in the bathroom for a very, very long time. I don't know how much experience you have with that, but basically it's just a very sensitive motion detector, which means that if you stand really still there, doing something at the sink or whatever, let's just put it that way, then the light goes out. And then you're standing in the room, waving your hand around so the light turns back on. So aside from the fact that I replaced it and have now put myself in an awkward situation with this example, these are the basics of automation where I say I want to enter a room and have the light turn on. And ideally, it should be just the way I prefer it at that moment. That's a tricky topic. And it's the same with the shutters, especially now during the darker time of year. By the time I get home, it's already dark. And when I leave in the morning, it's not light yet. So when do I open the shutters? When do I close them again? No, it doesn't have to be automated, but in this scenario, it just makes sense. For me, these are the absolute game changers. Maybe a bit boring, but they actually bring so much benefit.
I totally agree with you. And I mean, in the end, there's actually quite a bit going on behind the scenes to make sure it all works smoothly, so to speak, so that there are no false triggers, so that the light doesn't turn on when you don't want it to, or that special cases are taken into account as well. For example, something I think is absolutely brilliant, I actually came across it in a forum post. If I open my patio door and the roller shutter is already down, the door sensor simply detects that the patio door is open and the shutter is down, so it automatically raises the shutter again. Because obviously my intention is to go outside, and that's exactly when you want to quickly take out the trash in the evening or something like that. I do that through the garden, and it's just brilliant. These are the little things that even my wife has come to appreciate. She's not exactly the biggest smart home fan, but this is really cool. These are simple things, but they still make life easier and more comfortable, and they always feel nice somehow. Every time I open that patio door, I'm happy and think, wonderful, the shutter goes up all by itself. I don't have to tell Alexa or pull out the app to raise it or anything like that. It just happens automatically. For me are already cool, simple, everyday automations that just add real value.
And you also shouldn't forget that things like this can sometimes be important for safety as well. For example, if worst case, there's a fire in your home and there's smoke, you don't want to have to use an app, grab your phone, press a button or anything like that. Your first instinct is simply to open the door and maybe escape, depending on how serious it is. Or also with children, you can't explain to a child, well, you have to stay calm, then press this button, then wait until it's ready, or you first have to run to the tablet that's hanging in another room. You can't do that. And I actually did the same thing. I don't live on the ground floor, so maybe that's not necessarily the best option for me. But if you really think about smoke developing, well, then the instinct is simply to open the door, let it out, because that's basically the foundation for anything. So what I'm trying to say is it's sensible, it's helpful, but it can also be a safety issue. And I think when all these gears mesh together, that's really a huge, huge benefit of automation.
Absolutely. I think that's great. Yeah, shutters and lights are definitely, of course, really the basics where you can then use door contacts, motion detectors, presence sensors, cameras, or whatever else to record movement patterns, and then based on that, control lights and so on. That's definitely a cool thing. But for me, what also counts as part of the basics are simple things like making sure the lawnmower robot starts at the right time, or the vacuum robot that the irrigation system starts at the right time, and only when it's necessary, and so on. These are a bit more convenience features, but from my point of view, they are definitely really useful and helpful for making life easier and bringing more convenience to everyday life.
It's always crucial that you fine-tune these things. So if we think about controlling lighting, for example, of course, you can just say on, off, white or dark in this case. But what about the fine-tuning? How bright do you actually need it? Or maybe do you need colored light right now? For example, in my case, because I'm a big fan of this, when I'm sitting here working, this kind of lighting isn't really helpful for focused work. And honestly, it's also not great for staying productive over a longer period. Especially during the darker days, by 2 p.m. at the latest, this lighting makes me tired and I just want to not really do much of anything anymore. That's when it really helps to fine-tune things, make adjustments, and maybe also look at what your daily routine is like so you can really tailor these fine adjustments to fit that. And also, like you said, do you need to water or not? Of course, you could say you always water from 2 p.m. on for 3 minutes. But if the weather station is currently reporting rain, the data is there, then you have to use it and integrate it in a meaningful way, because that's when you actually get the real benefit. And you clearly have this foundation for automation. You have an idea, irrigation, lighting, whatever it may be. And from there, you basically go through all these steps and keep trying to fine-tune it further and further. That's why I always say, for example, you might set up an automation, but to get it to the point, coming back to the topic where it becomes a top-notch automation, you'll really have to tinker with it for quite a while. I mean, I've been doing this whole thing for a long time now, and honestly, the number of times I've scrapped my automations, you really shouldn't even tell anyone about it.
Yeah, that's it. They seem like simple things, but when you take all the contextual information into account, when you also consider the different situations that can arise and so on, then from what seems like a simple automation just to control a light, something relatively complex can develop. And that's sometimes a bit of a downside for me when it comes to automations, because they can become complex pretty quickly and you might not be able to fully grasp them anymore. That's sometimes the challenge. But basically, it's of course really cool to have the ability to build in all these different conditions, to define various types of triggers and so on in order to achieve the same result. And ultimately, of course, the goal is that you no longer have to operate anything manually, but that things just magically turn on and off by themselves. And that's definitely a good thing. I think this might be a good segue into another important topic where automations can help, which in my view is something like saving energy, where you make sure that things actually turn off if it's not necessary because no one is in the room or in the house, or when people are sleeping or whatever the case may be, then things are simply switched off. Prime example, as I mentioned, is when you're sleeping, but that's actually a topic that's not as straightforward as it seems. I actually addressed this recently in a video because I built a fairly complex automation with N8N, which now also runs with AI, because there are just so many cases that need to be taken into account. Because if you're a family of 4, like me, and you don't have some kind of sensor attached to each person that tells you when someone is actually sleeping. You really only have signals that can give you some indication that someone might be asleep. But you then have to combine several of these signals to calculate the probability that someone is actually sleeping. Because, as I said, at least for me, there isn't any clear cut. There's no sensor that tells me this person is sleeping now and now all four are sleeping, but rather it's simply a matter of probability where you check, for example, if there's no one left on the ground floor, we have 2 floors, okay, then there's already a certain probability. If they're upstairs, it could be that people are already on their way to bed or already in bed, but it doesn't have to be. Is there still movement in the hallway upstairs and so on? Are the phones charging? And then there are all the other signals that, taken together, lead to a decision. Is it night now and are people sleeping, or is it not yet the case that people are asleep? And so, can you already put the house into sleep mode to save energy, shut everything down, lock everything up, which is also a security issue, and so on, which is actually really cool, I think, at night, because usually nothing happens then, and you can really put the house into a special mode. But you also have to know when to activate this mode, and I just don't feel like activating it manually. It really has to run automatically. It also has to work when I'm not at home, when the family is there, who, as I said, might not all be super smart home savvy. And yes, that's definitely a really exciting thing. And you can actually build quite complex automations with it. And I think AI is a really cool approach here as well to say, as I mentioned, I actually bring in more of a probable approach. I don't even use rigid rules anymore because rigid rules would become so complex that I wouldn't be able to keep track of them myself.
Yeah, even if you were to work it out in such fine detail, you'd probably still end up with cases where it fails at some point. So basically, over weeks or months, it's just a process of trial and error because there's always a scenario you didn't anticipate. That's just how it is, unfortunately. I mean, sure, if I look at my own daily routine, it's actually pretty consistent. So you can deduce a lot. And I would even say that if someone observed me in my daily life, they could make very, very accurate predictions. But then you have that one day that doesn't fit the pattern where you could say, okay, based on that feature, you would have recognized it. And that's exactly what I don't have covered in my automation. And that's basically how you make your way through it. And since you mentioned AI, I actually find that really fascinating with Home Assistant because compared to IO Broker, for example, Home Assistant has, in my opinion, a much stronger foundation for AI, simply because many things are logged by default. And you have a lot of entry points that can help you with this automation. Calendar, logbook, the individual state changes that are logged for each device, and so on. So you have such a strong data foundation right out of the box, which you probably don't get in this form with other systems. And if I think back to IO Broker now, sure, a lot is possible there as well. And I'm not trying to deny that at all. And I also don't want to say it's a bad system. Not at all. But there's a fundamental difference here that I think will really come into play with this topic. And if we take a more general look now, the architecture of Home Assistant, this division, so that you really have rooms, floors, you assign devices, you basically create, if you will, this meta structure where not only the voice assistant, but also an AI knows more precisely, okay, you have a lamp, it's in the study, and right now you're talking to the device that's also in that room. So you probably want the light to turn on, and that's an interesting comparison too. I implemented this function with the Amazon Echo, so you can say, turn on the light. And then the light turns on exactly in the room where you're currently sitting, or rather where you're talking to the device. But that only works if you are in the, I don't want to say the name in the Echo app, so let's just call it that. You actually have to set up this assignment. In other words, I have the devices in Home Assistant, I bring them onto this Echo device, and then I assign them again there. And with the Home Assistant, Voice Assistant as an example, or generally with the structure behind it, you can already save yourself all that effort because the devices know, well, the devices themselves don't actually know since they're just devices. But basically, the central system behind it knows who is sitting where and how the structures are connected to each other. That means if I'm sitting in the study and say, turn on the light, it's already logical for us humans, of course, but now to some extent also for the technology, so that Home Assistant doesn't turn on the light in the bathroom or even worse in the garden. That's already a huge strength.
Yeah, definitely. So that's really cool. Let's get back to automations. We've already looked at a few aspects of the basics. For me, that definitely includes things like lighting control, shutters, so darkening the room and so on. That's definitely important too. Then there are basic house functions like irrigation, mowing, vacuuming, and so on. We've already touched a bit on energy saving. Another important aspect is security. How did you address the topic of security in your setup in automation?
Well, security is always in many ways a bit, well, I wouldn't say it's entirely relative, but it's always to some degree somewhat dependent on your own life, on your own basics that you have. So the basics also play a certain role here as well. For example, we have several security cameras on the house, especially in the garden area, because we have both the advantage and the disadvantage that our property isn't really one where you can see a lot from the outside. That's nice because you have privacy, but at the same time, it's not so great because especially during the darker months, well, if someone jumps over the fence, you'll never see them from the outside again. In theory, someone could do whatever they want in there. And cameras help, especially during the darker months, to create a certain sense of security, and directly connected to that is the evaluation of the camera footage, so that an analysis is actually running of what is currently being seen. For example, now a trigger goes off, okay, a person has been detected, and now you can go ahead and say, I'll run an AI over it either locally or in the cloud. That's just a matter of how you implement it. And based on that, you get a textual description, because the fact is, you can simply process text digitally much better than images. Sure, I can have an image sent to me via push notification, but I'll always have to look at it myself and decide how relevant it is. But if I now get a textual description, for example, a really simple case like a person with a dark mask over their head, then I immediately become alert and know, okay, now I need to check. But if I get a notification like a person is playing with the dog, then I know, okay, that's probably just someone from the family, for example, so I don't need to worry about it at all. That's a security factor, and the whole thing is also linked to presence, and then going further to the topic of the alarm system. You wouldn't believe how often I used to forget to turn on the alarm system when I left, because it's just one more thing you could actually deduce it. If I leave a certain zone, then that stupid thing should just turn on. So where's the problem with that? And I finally implemented that with Home Assistant because the tracking is well integrated there too. And now it actually makes much more sense because you have several different zones, and depending on the specific zone, different automations are triggered. For example, the alarm system is activated, the camera surveillance is on, and you really don't have to do anything except just leave. And you know exactly, okay, I'm informed, I don't have to worry. And that's also a great example of how different automations come together to form a complete picture. Exactly the security aspect you mentioned.
Absolutely. So you can do a lot with automations, even things like that. What I always find really helpful are also the simple automations that notify you when you leave the house, if, for example, a window is still open or things like that. That's a very simple thing, but I think it's really helpful. Or the garage, for example, if you forget to close it, you get a notification asking if you really meant to leave it open. Sometimes you leave it open on purpose, for example, if the kids are playing outside or whatever. But then we get a notification that's also actionable, so you can directly close the garage if you really left it open by accident and so on. These are things that are convenient and provide an extra level of security without being particularly disruptive, I'd say. And I definitely think that's a really good thing. And now something completely new for us. I was actually able to install a smart lock. That was a taboo topic for us for a long time. Very
cool.
Now I'm thrilled. I really think it's awesome. It really takes convenience to another level, massively so when you can just enter the house comfortably with your fingerprint and also know, okay, the door will be locked at night. Even if I forget, it's simply locked. Or when I leave the house, or rather when I leave the zone and everyone is out, then it definitely locks as well. I just don't have to worry about it anymore. I definitely think it's a really nice feature, very helpful, and it actually gives me a greater sense of security now. Previously, there were always some concerns in the house, let's say that the smart lock itself could be vulnerable and that someone might gain access to the house by hacking into it or something like that. But honestly, if someone were to hack into the house and somehow access a smart lock over the network, then honestly, we have a completely different problem, I have to say.
Absolutely. So I would actually say, of course, realistically, it's possible for someone to do something like that. I mean, in the end, any security can be breached. The question is always about the amount of effort involved, obviously. But if I think about the classic key, I always like to put it bluntly. I could just hit you over the head, take your key, and get in that way too. So that's at least just as insecure. With a smart lock, at least, for example, if you haven't activated geofencing or something like that, you still have the benefit that, especially with the iPhone layer, Face ID is required. So someone would also have to steal your face or at least know the code to your iPhone. So there's I would say, a slightly higher barrier than with a traditional key. And of course, you also have the advantage that if you lose your smartphone, you can block access. Try doing that with a key, especially in an apartment building with a master key system. Well, to be fair, they probably don't have a smart lock either, but then you've got a real drama on your hands. Luckily, I've never lost a key myself, but I've heard stories of people losing their office keys too. And hey, that's a real mess, especially if you still have a traditional key and not some kind of push button thing.
Well, for us, I mean, we live in the countryside, so it does happen sometimes that we go outside, the kids play in front of the house, you leave the key in the door, or it used to be like that at our house when you'd say, well, yeah, come on, we're just in front of the house anyway, and so on. Then the kids then run off ahead and away, heading toward the forest because the forest is right next to us. And then, of course, you run after the kids and end up in the forest somehow while the key is still in the front door of the house. Honestly, I think that's just as dangerous, or even much more dangerous, to be honest. So I actually find it really convenient now to just say, I lock up and that's it for now. And I don't have to take a key with me or anything at all. I can just comfortably get back in with my fingerprint or something like that. And I can't forget that the key is still in the door outside or anything like that. So I really think that's a very nice thing.
And of course, you also have the advantage that with many, not all, but many, you can still use the traditional key as well. So if you really say, no, I don't want that at all, not that my phone is now my key, well, then you just take it with you. That's just how it is. And I do understand these concerns to a certain extent, because of course we always have the situation that technology is often very abstract for people, and understanding and knowing all these backgrounds is not easy. And I wouldn't claim to know myself how secure it is or what you would have to do to break all this encryption. I'm not an expert in that. I wouldn't presume to be. You probably know the basic principles, but when it comes to the details, we're out as well. But I think this basic understanding really helps a lot to at least make a fundamental assessment.
Exactly, that's how it is. Yeah, we've talked a lot about the basics now.
Now I want to hear about your fancy automations here.
Well, my automations aren't all that fancy, but there are a few special things or so that maybe not everyone has. So one automation that I still think is really cool, it's actually super simple, but it's so helpful. We have an automation that when the kids are allowed to watch TV, a timer starts in Home Assistant, and after 25 minutes, there's a first notification saying, attention, the TV will turn off in 5 minutes. Then 1 minute before, there's another message delivered via the Alexa that's right next to the TV saying, dear children, the TV will turn off in 1 minute. And then the TV just turns off because with the Apple TV integration, that's just a great feature. I can tell when the thing is turned on. I can also turn it off again from Home Assistant, and it's just a simple setup. I use the Alexa integration for the voice announcements, and the whole thing also sends a push notification to us, where you also have the option to escalate the alert or extend the timer. Sometimes there's a need to say, okay, you can have 5 more minutes, because I'm just quickly finishing cleaning the kitchen or something like that. But it's just a super simple setup. But it's really helpful, because at least this way you make sure that in the heat of the moment, and that does happen sometimes when the kids are allowed to watch TV, which they should be able to do sometimes, especially after a whole day at school and playing outside, then it's okay for them to sit in front of the TV for half an hour. That does happen. But then they should really stick to that half hour and not end up watching longer just because you decide to use the time to cook or clean or do whatever else you need to do. And then you might lose track of time yourself, and instead of just half an hour, they end up watching for an hour or even longer, because of course the kids aren't going to say on their own, oh, half an hour is up now, obviously. And they just keep watching. They would watch for 3 hours if the thing kept running. And that's where automation is really great. Sometimes it's actually a bit annoying, because then they suddenly come running and ask, hey, can we watch a bit longer, and so on. Because of course the thing just shuts off, no exceptions. But it's honestly a cool automation, so simple yet so helpful.
So how is it set up when the kids turn on the TV? Does it start then? So it's not tied to a specific time. Is it really managed dynamically?
It is tied to a specific time. At the moment, I don't have any detection in place to see if the kids are actually sitting in front of the TV.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
That's the only, let's say, downside. But we normally never watch TV during the day anyway. And that's why it's basically set up so that if the TV is turned on before 8 p.m., it's guaranteed to be the kids. And that works in 99% of cases. We've already had 1 or 2 cases where, for example, during the day when we were on vacation or something, someone said, I need to iron my shirts or something like that. I'll watch a movie while I iron. And then the notification pops up, but then you can just turn off the timer and that's fine too. That's not a problem either. But overall, the time control works very well. Of course, you could try to make it fancier by using some mechanisms to detect who is actually turning on the TV or sitting in front of it, or maybe which profile is currently active on the TV or something like that. But it's really not that fancy, so keeping it simple is enough. Sometimes things don't have to be too complicated if the simple solution works just as well in automation.
That just gave me an idea. I'm not sure, but I think the Apple TV also outputs what's currently playing, at least the title. Now you could use AI to determine whether it's a children's show, children's program, or whatever. So make a classification, children's content or not. And if it's for children, or in other words, if it's children's content, then the timer starts. Of course, that could introduce some potential for errors.
What if I want to watch Benjamin Blümchen while ironing or something? Then I've got a problem.
How often has that happened?
Not that often.
Okay, so for those few times, you'll actually have to stop it yourself. I think that would be confusing.
But I think that's good, yeah. You could even take it further. I haven't even thought that far yet. But you could actually even log how much TV was watched and so on. Because if you really know what was watched and who probably watched it, that's actually pretty interesting. So I need to think about whether the concept could be developed a bit further.
So when you've implemented the automation with AI, I want to know how well it works, because I can really imagine that could be pretty exciting, especially with this categorization.
Challenge accepted.
I'm looking forward to the short that's coming. I'm really curious about it. But that's also the nice thing. When you just talk about automation like this, sometimes these brief thoughts come into play and suddenly you don't really have a completely new construct. You have to say the focus does shift a little bit. So not anymore. What you have is basically a focus on the timer. And if you implement this change now, then the focus will be on detection, categorization, and then deriving what needs to be done. I can imagine that this will be exciting. And I also see real potential for the whole topic of AI in smart homes in the future, especially when it comes to classifying these dynamic things.
I think that's actually relatively simple. Yes, really.
I could imagine that.
With something like an AI task in Home Assistant, you could probably implement it pretty easily. But I have to try it out. I will try it out. I'll report back and then we'll see how well it works. I'm really
curious about that. So really cool thing. Yeah, I have to say I don't have any timers. I don't need them. No one watches TV here during the day. So TV in general is just a medium. It's not just the classic TV, but the whole topic of television. I don't know. I don't even have a TV in the living room anymore. Well, we do have the projector screen, okay. But hey, it's really only on once in a blue moon. Honestly, looking back, that was probably the most unnecessary investment of my life because I hardly ever use it. Really, if I think about it now, I think maybe once or twice this year at most. The only time the TV is on regularly with YouTube is on Saturdays after grocery shopping. When I get back and have something to eat, then the TV is on for maybe half an hour. But otherwise, no, not even during the week. I don't know, it just doesn't really fit with my schedule. I have to say, I'm more the type who watches something on YouTube on the PC on the side. If I'm building some automation or working on some details on the blog, then I might have something running. But otherwise, I don't know, I'm just not into it at all. Well, and to be fair, I have to say, in the evenings right before falling asleep, it does happen sometimes. But that's the only regularity, and I don't need a timer for that. The timer, so to speak, is inside me. At some point, that switch just flips, telling me, okay, that's enough now.
For myself, I wouldn't really need a timer like that either, but I definitely think it's a nice thing to have. By now, we've really come to rely on it. It runs completely automatically. Today, for example, we had a situation where for some reason, I'm having problems with the Alexa integration in Home Assistant, and it can't authenticate anymore. And now this automation is stuck. And of course, that immediately sets off an alarm in the house. Yeah, what's going on? Why isn't it working anymore? That's really annoying because you really do rely on it since it's actually very, very good. But what about you? Do you have any slightly fancier automations? Go ahead, tell us.
I'm just thinking because it's always a bit tricky. It's all pretty normal for me. So maybe it's not that fancy, but what really helps me a lot is the combination of Home Assistant and N8N for logging purposes. For example, logging from the wallbox. I mean, it's actually totally unnecessary. Everyone will probably say now, why are you even logging that? It's already included. But I wanted and still want to have an overview of how the car's electricity consumption develops over time. And now the combination is that Home Assistant has access to the wallbox via Modbus, so it knows when charging is happening and when it's not. And as soon as charging is finished, I get an email summary. I actually only have it set up to check that the integration worked. To be honest, I never actually read that email. It sits in my inbox and I delete it right away because I know, okay, it was logged. And all this data is then stored in a Google Sheet. Honestly, I only look at it once in a blue moon, but I have the data. Maybe that's a bit fancy.
The wallbox doesn't log that itself, or what?
Actually, it does. So I could just go into the wallbox software and everything is logged there, including price and so on. That would theoretically be enough for me. The only thing I additionally log are the car's data, like the mileage. It's no secret that my vehicle is a leased car. That means the mileage obviously plays a role. And based on the mileage, I also calculate how far I got with the last charge, what the average consumption is, and what the resulting costs are so that I can, let's say, estimate a bit. Because at the beginning, the question was raised, how does consumption develop in summer and winter, and what's the difference there? And this is the first electric car I've driven, so it's all kind of new, and it's actually interesting to see how things develop. Sometimes you have a feeling like, I think I didn't get as far this time as I did last time. You know how it is. And just to back it up a bit with data, because that can also be interesting for the blog and for your own sense of things, you have to say, so you can kind of validate yourself a little. That's why I actually do it. But it's not really a case where I'd say you actually need it. It's more of it's a bit of tinkering, but with a solid and reliable foundation, I'd say. So yeah, you don't have to do it if you don't want to, but it's definitely interesting to try out. But
cars are generally quite interesting for automation, I think. I've already done a few things in that area myself. For example, I built my own PV charging setup at the beginning because even though I have the wall box and the inverter from the same manufacturer, it was originally announced that they would integrate and coordinate nicely with each other so you could ensure surplus charging, meaning the car would only be charged with the extra electricity coming from the roof that the house doesn't use and not draw power from the grid, which is actually a really cool feature. But at the beginning, this feature wasn't available. That meant it was supposed to come at some point, but it just wasn't available yet. So I just built it myself using Home Assistant because I had the inverter, the car, and the wall box integrated there. And then I was basically able to coordinate the entire charging process according to the surplus electricity available in the house. I thought that was a pretty cool setup. But then I deactivated it again because now, thanks to a firmware update, the wall box also supports surplus charging natively, which of course is much more convenient in my opinion. Exactly. And what I also built for myself, and I recently made a video about it, is the topic of climate control, because I often find myself in this situation. I also have an electric car, and I think the stationary climate control feature is just amazing. And not just in winter, but also in summer, so you always get into a perfectly temperature-controlled car. But what happens to me very often is that I have this great feature, but I often walk up to the car, see it, and think, damn, if only you had turned on the climate control, it would be nice and cool now, or nice and warm. And then I end up sitting in a cold car again. Especially when I've driven somewhere and the car is just sitting there in the parking lot. So now I've set up an automation that monitors the distance between the car and me. And based on that, it sends me a push notification when I approach the car within a certain distance. And reminds me that I should turn on the stationary climate control now. Then I can activate the stationary climate control directly via actionable push, and it turns on right away so you don't forget it. You don't realize it again until you're right by the car. Damn.
I have to chuckle about that because I was in exactly that situation this morning. This morning it was 1 degree, and normally at those temperatures I let the car preheat because it can do it. So why shouldn't I use it? And yes, I remembered while I was just putting on my shoes, which basically means it was already too late, because from that point, it takes less than 5 minutes until I'm downstairs. Now you could say, okay, just take those 5 minutes anyway. But at that point, there's really no point in starting anymore. So I've noticed, at least with those outside temperatures, it really takes about 15 to 20 minutes before you get in and think, this could actually be my living room now. Yeah, I should do that too.
Although at home or at work, I find it still okay for me, at least, because there I have a pretty consistent schedule for when I get into the car in the morning and when I leave again in the evening. So you can just use a fixed schedule, which is already available in the car anyway, to have it automatically climate controlled. But what really matters to me is the situation where I drive somewhere, like into the city or wherever, and the car is parked in a parking garage, or maybe in a parking garage, it's not even that bad, since it's usually not so cold or hot there, but outside, parked somewhere in the blazing sun. For example, if I'm at the zoo or something like that, and then I walk back to the exit and approach the parking lot, then I get this push notification reminding me, hey, don't forget, activate the stationary air conditioning. I find those kinds of automations really convenient.
That's actually something that's already giving me ideas about how I could implement it. What always resonates with me a bit is that I tend to think very dynamically. So you're absolutely right when you say you could do this with a schedule, because, well, I only know it from my own life. Usually I leave the house at almost the same time every day. If it's 10 minutes later, sometimes that's not a big deal either, because those extra 10 minutes don't really matter. But most of the time, I don't like that solution, because I think, no, I want a solution that works in at least 90% of cases, even if you don't have a schedule. That's still something I stumble over a bit. That would actually be another wish of mine, where I'd say, okay, if my smart home knew, all right, he's about to leave in the next few minutes, then it could start preheating, or more generally, start preconditioning the temperature, regardless of the season. That would actually be cool. Let's see.
You could also tie that to other signals. So, for example, I don't know, I just made myself a coffee. Then I know, okay, when I make a coffee, it'll be about 10 minutes before I'm sitting in the car or something like that. No idea, could be the case. So I could also tie it to that and say, whenever the coffee is made, then 10 minutes later, the thing turns on or something like that. Or, I don't know, 5 minutes later. Yeah, you'd have to think about it. But it's definitely cool if you can also control it from your smart home, if the car is integrated. Those are really cool things that increase convenience even more.
Absolutely. And maybe another automation. Let's move away from the car for a bit. I don't know if anyone would call this basic, but the mail notification. As soon as someone puts something in the mailbox, I get a push notification. Although I just realized I didn't check the mailbox today, even though I got the notification. So even that doesn't protect you from forgetting something. But you're basically always kept in the loop. And what I think I've solved pretty cleverly, at least from my perspective, is that I built a script in Home Assistant. And this script is solely responsible for distributing the notifications. That means you no longer send notifications directly to the device itself, but always to the script. And now you have the option. Do you want it to be output as a voice message? Do you want to send it as a push notification? So you can choose to always send it via push. If you check that option, then you always get the push notification, regardless of what other conditions may or may not apply. And the default scenario is when I'm at home, I get a voice announcement on the Echo. When I'm out and about, then I get a push notification. Because it always really annoyed me personally, for example, when I'm working from home and I get the push notification saying the mail has arrived. I don't need that. You can just tell me directly or have a lamp blink for all I care. So I try to intervene a little in that regard. And of course, for these basic things or the important things, for example, if the alarm system goes off, a push notification is always sent. And in that case, an announcement is also made. So there, both things are combined again. But for the standard case, you really just have to choose the way that makes the most sense from my point of view, because to be fair, you have to admit something. When I'm sitting at home, I don't carry my phone around with me all day either. So often you have to say, yeah, unfortunately, I should really break that habit too. But it's exactly then when you actually need to know something that you don't have it with you. And that's why I think that approach is actually quite practical.
Yeah, that's where it comes into play for me again. You always have to keep in mind that there are different people in the household. And we have a golden rule. Everything that gets automated must still continue to work in the classic manual way, also in the traditional way it used to work. Now, the topic of mail notifications can sometimes be a bit annoying because there's a housemate, I'm not going to name any names, who likes to just check the mailbox all the time to see if there's anything inside. So the flap is always opened and then let fall back down, and that's where the sensor is installed. Then I always get a notification that the mail has arrived, but actually it was only this one resident who checked to see if there was any mail. These are things that are not yet ideal, and I'll provide a solution for them. So I was thinking, for example, of attaching an e-ink display, since they use very, very little energy, to the mailbox, which would say whether it's full or empty, something like that. So you don't have to look inside anymore, and the sensor doesn't get triggered and so on. And then you can really, because I actually have two sensors. I have one sensor for inserting mail and one sensor for emptying. That means then it would really work because it's actually already set up so that there's a state. It's full, it's empty, so to speak. But the problem is the moment someone looks in from above to see if there's anything inside, it messes up the whole mechanism because then the thing is always considered full, so to speak, even though there's nothing in it. And that's a bit annoying. That's why you always have to be a bit careful with automations. That's what I mean when I say you have to consider all eventualities so that it works perfectly for everyone in the household.
You'll laugh. We actually have a similar problem. So we live in a 2-family house. That means we're not the only ones in this house. And the sensor on the mailbox is quite sensitive. And now there's one person in this house. It's really just one person who sometimes likes to slam that door shut firmly. And then, of course, you get the notification that the mail has arrived. And it's already become a running gag that we always start to chuckle and say that someone just came home, there's no mail. And yes, at one point we even considered, just for fun, using it as a kind of presence detection. So of course not seriously, but maybe changing the push notification, not to mail has arrived, but to person XY has come home. Yeah, no automation is going to be able to catch that because those are exactly the edge cases you think about, but then you could adjust it and say, okay, I'll make it less sensitive. But we tried that and then the mail just doesn't show up in the notification anymore.
You'd need a door contact sensor on your front door for that.
For example, that would be an option. It is what it is. It's okay. So instead of getting mail once a day, I get it 3 times. That's fine too, because basically that's where the human factor comes into play again. I can estimate based on the time whether it's realistic or not. So if someone slams the door at 10 p.m., it's not that bad, but if they slam it, it's obvious that the mail carrier wasn't there. I'd be surprised and I'd probably just stare in disbelief if it really was the mail. So from that perspective, it's okay, it's fine. And living with a bit of error tolerance, I think that actually makes it kind of fun. I mean, technology just isn't flawless. We experience that every day, and that's totally fine.
Yeah, so maybe just to wrap things up, I think my funniest automation, or maybe the silliest one, is still, honestly, the hairdresser notification. Shout out to Flautomation who gave me this idea, and it's really cool. And it's just funny because you always get a humorous notification, AI generated, that makes a little joke about the state of my hair when it's time to go to the hairdresser again. And when I'm actually at the hairdresser, the zone detects that I was there. Then the notification comes up, were you at the hairdresser? If you say yes, it saves that as the last date you went. And then the counter is basically reset to 0 days. And I recently made another video about that, about how I made this AI phone call.
Fantastic.
But that's actually super cool if it would work and if you could get it to comply with data protection laws so that you could actually say, I recognize that I need to go to the hairdresser, and then the hairdresser is automatically called to make an appointment. That's a really cool thing. But of course, you could say you don't really need that. First of all, whether you need to go to the hairdresser or not, you can see that in the morning when you look in the mirror, and I don't need a notification for that. And I can also make a hairdresser appointment, for example, when I was last at the hairdresser, I can already book the next one then or whatever. You can certainly solve it that way too. But in general, I still think this approach of making automatic calls from the smartphone is cool because there are other situations where it could be necessary. Situations that you might even be able to detect in a smart home. For example, if something breaks and the smart home automatically schedules an appointment with a repairman or whatever, or based on my health data, my smart home recognizes that I should go to the doctor again, or who knows what else. That could get pretty smart. Of course, it might be a bit spooky if all of a sudden your smart home schedules a doctor's appointment for you and then sends you a message saying, I've just made an appointment for you with the doctor next week. Maybe a bit weird, but on the other hand, also kind of funny and cool.
I think we definitely have to get used to the fact that data is so important and in a way is the future. And in the end, when you go to the doctor and get a blood test or something, it's always about the data. It's just that on one side, it's processed automatically, and on the other side, it's processed by humans. Things will change, definitely. And I think the beginnings are a bit rough, but then it will get going. You can even broaden the topic. For example, autonomous driving. I regularly ask myself, would I get into a car that drives itself? A typical example from the USA? I don't know. I trust the technology, but there's still that spark of skepticism. I don't know. And on the other hand, you look at airplanes, they fly completely on autopilot. Sure, there are pilots on board. So there's still the human factor, no question. But in normal flight operations, when everything is running smoothly, the autopilot does most of the work.
I think you get used to it. Look, I mean, you also get on a roller coaster. Yes, absolutely. You could say the same thing, yes. Anything could happen, but people still do it. There are already a lot of trains in airports or even in some cities that run without drivers. People get on those too. Of course, that's on rails, so it's a bit more regulated in terms of what can happen because the directions are clearly defined. There usually isn't any cross traffic, no pedestrians or anything like that. Of course, it's a much more, let's say, controlled environment than a public street, but I think people will just get used to it as a normal part of life. That you get into a car like that and it just drives you somewhere.
And it's exciting too. Just think of all the time you gain from it. When I think about it, we just talked about this, the topic of travel time, all the things you can do during that time. And hey, even if it's just 2 or 3 emails you can answer and you know, okay, that's already taken care of. Or for example, with what we're doing right now, podcast, YouTube, and so on, you can actually use that time to reply to comments. Because, well, if you're not working full-time on your content, then you have to do it whenever you have the time. And that could be from the car to the supermarket. Okay, maybe that's a bit of an extreme example. Or if you actually set aside time for it. But in a case like this, when the car is driving itself, then that time is just available.
So I think that was a good closing statement. We've talked for quite a while now. We've reflected a lot on automations, but I think there are even cooler automations out there than what we discussed today. That's why I'm really curious to see if the listeners or viewers will share some cool automation ideas with us as well. Then maybe we can talk about them in a future episode. I think that would be pretty cool. And otherwise, thank you very much, Lukas. As always, it was fun. Happy smart homing, and I think we'll talk again soon.
Definitely. We still need to exchange a few ideas, and I want to know how things went with your automation.
Exactly. Great. See you then. Take care. See you then. Ciao.